There's a couple of reasons that we really ought to care about the kinds of food webs that we work with in pitcher plants.
Food webs throughout the world and ecosystems throughout the world are losing their top predators. Habitats are being contracted because of human development and habitat change that takes place. So we want to know what those effects are on entire food webs.
Emerging Science is a Vermont Public Television production in partnership with and funded by Vermont NSF Epscor. Epscor, supporting science and engineering in Vermont colleges and businesses and encouraging young Vermonters to seek careers in science.
Hi, I'm Amy Seidel, and welcome to Emerging Science. This week, the subject is food webs. Many of us here in Vermont are familiar with the idea of food webs. We get much of our food from local landscape and are increasingly eating regionally. But the term food web means something very specific to ecologists as they examine the whole range of organisms and their interactions throughout ecosystems. What happens when a top predator is lost or the habitat changes drastically? Modeling and predicting these effects proves difficult. Scientists, including UVM's Nick Catelli and Aaron Ellison of Harvard University, have found a solution. They realize that the habitat of a single carnivorous pitcher plant can provide a living laboratory and model for much larger ecological scenarios. And a special treat for this week's episode, Nick and his colleagues have provided our musical track.
My name is Nick Catelli. I'm a professor of biology at the University of Vermont, and we are standing in my study site. We are at Molly Bog, and this is one of the finest examples of an ombrotrophic or rain-fed bog in Vermont. We have to go back about 15,000 years. At that time, this entire area was covered by ice and glaciers. As the glaciers receded, this little bowl that we're standing in was scooped out. The bowl is isolated and it does not have contact with the surrounding water table. There's no oxygen flowing into this water. This is anoxic, acidic water, and there are only a few specialized kinds of plants that can live in it. Most plants have roots that they put down into the soil, and that's where they get their nutrients from. But this soil is just this waterlogged mat that doesn't have much oxygen in it, and it's not a good place for plants to be able to draw up nutrients. There are a number of unique plants that grow in this habitat, but the one that I've been working on for the past 10 years or so is the carnivorous pitcher plant, Sarracenia purpurea. Rather than getting its nitrogen from the soil, this is a plant that captures insects, and it uses the nitrogen in those dead insects as its source.
There are hundreds of bogs in Vermont and hundreds of bogs in Massachusetts and thousands of bogs across New England. I'm Aaron Ellison, and I'm a senior ecologist here at Harvard Forest. Harvard Forest was set up in 1907. This bog has been here on this location for somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years. This is a leaf of a pitcher plant, and it basically sits in the bog like this. And the mouth of the pitcher plant is open to the sky, and it accumulates rainwater. Of course, they're carnivorous plants, and these traps filled with rainwater are what capture the prey and the insects that we're very interested in. But our initial impetus for this research was the observation that pitcher plants that capture a lot of nitrate coming in from the atmosphere look different from pitchers growing in areas where there isn't a lot of nitrogen. Historically, rainwater was really pretty clean. There's not a lot of nutrients coming down out of the sky. Since the industrial age began on the planet in the 1850s, the burning of fossil fuels releases nitrogen and nitrogen dioxide into the atmosphere, where it gets rained back down as nitric acid.
These plants evolved originally to get their nitrogen from catching insect prey. Now, under low nitrogen conditions, the plant forms a nice circular tube that fills up with rainwater and uses that to catch its prey. But under high nitrogen, the plant will no longer make this nice trap. The leaf instead will become more flattened.
And we asked ourselves, so number one, why was this happening? And number two, could we actually experimentally show that this was related to the amount of nitrogen coming in from the atmosphere? Could we actually use this biological indicator as a way to go around from bog to bog and say, over here, this bog is getting a lot of nitrogen in it, and we can tell that because the pictures look one way. And over here, we have pictures that look a different way, and so they're not getting nearly as much nitrogen in them. The paper that we published on the suggestion of using pitcher plants as biological indicators has been picked up by Parks Canada, and they are using it in a monitoring scheme now for documenting ecological integrity in all the national parks in the Canadian Maritimes.
Nick and Aaron's original research using pitcher plants as biological indicators of air quality led to their current collaboration, modeling food webs.
By a food web, we mean the collection of organisms in an area that feed upon one another in some sort of a trophic chain. So food webs might consist of a base of vegetation. That's what we call the producer level. Now on this vegetation there are insects that will feed on it. We call those herbivores. They may be birds that then feed on the next layer. Those are our predators or our carnivores, and we may even have a top layer on top of that. All natural assemblages of plants and animals are organized into this type of food web with these what we call trophic interactions that take place between these different layers. Ecologists have been interested in food webs for a long time. They're very hard to study. For one thing, they're huge. Here we have an entire self-contained food web in a single pitcher. We can actually hold this entire food web in our hand. We can carry out experiments and manipulations that would be impossible to conduct in larger systems. The leaf folds up and forms this tube that opens up, and this opening up here will fill up with rainwater. And there are a couple adaptations for catching the prey. The first is this deep red color and the bright red veination that you see here on the inside edge. Many insects are attracted to that pattern, so that's going to cause them to come in and investigate. The plant will also secrete a primitive sugar like a nectar. That's going to draw in some insects. The insect prey will eventually fall down in here into the water that's contained in this and drown. Also, these are recurved hairs that are pointing downward on the inside of this leaf margin. And what those do is make it more difficult for the insect to get back out. The top predator in this is a flesh fly. It's a disgusting little larva with a black proboscis that crawls around like a worm and feeds on some of the other invertebrates in the system. There are a group of insects, mosquito larvae, midge larvae, mites, rotifers that live in this habitat. Some of those are going to break down or shred that prey up into smaller pieces. Then there's a whole subweb of bacteria that will break it down further that will actually release the nutrients. So let's go ahead and just look at the contents of one of these and see what we can get. Okay, first you see a lot of insect body parts. Also, do you see this little twitching animal right here? That is a second instar mosquito larva. This one is also another little worm, but it's moving in a more of a sinuous pattern here. This is the midge larvae. This is another one of the major components. Okay, this is the wolf. This is the top predator in these food webs. This is a flesh fly larva. It's the equivalent of the wolf in the system. We call this a mutualism. Both of the parties have a benefit. From the animal's perspective, they have a specialized habitat that they can live in, that they use to carry out part of their life history. And from the plant's perspective, the benefit is these nutrients that are released that it can take up.
This is a really nice food web. It's a complete food web. It's got 4 or 5 different levels, feeding levels in it. It's self-contained. Every pitcher throughout the bog has a food web in it. So if you're an experimental ecologist like Nick and I are, you have lots and lots of replicate pitchers that you can do experiments on.
As Nick and Aaron have explained, we have an entire food web housed inside each pitcher plant. One of their first modeling challenges: what happens when we lose the top predator in an ecological system?
One of the key things that we know is that these systems are oftentimes characterized by trophic cascades. And by this I mean, if we pull out that top predator, then the layer beneath it is released from predation. So with the top predator gone, we will see the intermediate level of foragers increase in their abundance. In systems where we have top predators, like wolves at Yellowstone, if we remove that layer, the next layer down, which are the herbivores, deer and bison and other grazers, may increase in numbers. And their increases are going to have negative effects on the vegetation, which is the layer that they feed on.
A food web is very similar in Yellowstone or New England. The top of the food web is always the top predator. The middle level is the deer and the elk and the moose. They graze off the plants. But to keep them in check, you have to have the top predator to prey on them. If you remove one of those critical components, you can really make the food web either crash, maybe explode for a time, but we've seen that the removal of top predators definitely affects the vegetative at the lower level, because then the mid-level, the deer, the grazers, all take advantage and they just keep exploding in numbers. The top predators are needed for any ecological system because it restores the health. And many people will say it restores the balance. And right now we're facing a very interesting situation in our Northeast where global warming may certainly be affecting our fir trees. What we're seeing is a huge moose explosion. The moose can just set up in one area all winter and never move. So any of the young trees that are coming up, they chew on and browse very heavily and may kill them. The only animal that kills moose outside of people are wolves. The wolf could keep them from browsing them as heavily in some areas. And there's nothing more pleasurable than to hear the howl of the wolf, because when you hear the howl of the wolf, you know you have a large protected ecological system. And it may not be protected in the point that it's wilderness, it just is that it's a working system and that the wolf can survive there, as can humans on the same landscape. If I could have one wish before I leave this earth, I would love to be able to go to northern Maine and hear wolves howl.
If you lose the top predators, what does that mean for the rest of the food web? We're doing this every day as humans in systems all around the planet where habitat is being fragmented, top predators are being hunted out, food webs are being simplified everywhere.
What is the effect on the food web of taking out the top predators? We'll assign 10 plants as controls, so the food web is not manipulated, but we will monitor it and see what its structure looks like. 10 other plants we will go in. We can actually temporarily remove the contents of an entire leaf, squirt it into a petri dish, pull out the top predators and remove them, and then replace the contents back. So we've gone in and stripped out the top predators, the equivalent of removing all the wolves from an area of forest.